Rosemary Kellerman had met Trevor at 26 at a mutual friend's dinner party, when he was still 3 years away from launching the consulting firm that would eventually consume most of both their lives. He'd been charming in that specific way ambitious men often are early on, full of plans, quick to laugh, generous with attention in a manner that felt, at the time, like genuine interest rather than what she'd later come to understand as a kind of performance he deployed strategically, dialing it up or down depending on what a given moment required of him. She'd fallen for him quickly, the way people do when they're 26 and haven't yet learned to distinguish between someone who's genuinely invested in you and someone who's simply very good at making people feel that way. They married 2 years later, in a small ceremony that Rosemary had planned almost entirely herself, a detail that would come to feel, in retrospect, like an early preview of the marriage's actual shape rather than a coincidence. Trevor launched his consulting firm, Kellerman Strategic Partners, the following year, funded partly by a small business loan and partly by savings Rosemary had contributed from her own graphic design work, a contribution that had never been formally documented or acknowledged in any of the business's founding paperwork, existing instead as one of those unspoken family debts that everyone understood but nobody had bothered to put in writing. The early years of the business were chaotic in the specific way startups often are, and Rosemary, working as a freelance graphic designer with flexible hours, found herself absorbed gradually into Trevor's business in ways that expanded far beyond what either of them had initially discussed. It started small, helping him format a client proposal one evening when his own design skills proved inadequate to the task, offering feedback on a pitch deck, fielding a call from a vendor when Trevor was traveling and couldn't be reached. Within 18 months, Rosemary was managing the firm's books entirely, a role she'd taken on almost accidentally after the firm's first bookkeeper quit and Trevor, panicked about an upcoming audit, had asked Rosemary to just help out for a few weeks while he found a replacement. The replacement never materialized. Rosemary kept doing the books for the next 6 years, alongside her own design work, without ever receiving a salary, a formal title, or even much acknowledgement beyond Trevor's occasional, offhand comment to colleagues that his wife helped out with some of the administrative stuff. She'd put her own career on hold twice during the marriage, each time framed, in the moment, as a temporary and reasonable sacrifice given the family's circumstances. The first pause came during the firm's major expansion in their 5th year of marriage, when Trevor landed 3 new corporate clients simultaneously and the resulting workload threatened to overwhelm the firm's small staff. Rosemary had scaled back her own design clients to nearly nothing for the better part of a year, managing invoicing, payroll, client communications, and a dozen other administrative functions that kept the expansion from collapsing under its own momentum, work that Trevor later described to a business journalist, in an interview Rosemary happened to read years afterward, as evidence of his own exceptional operational instincts during a critical growth period. No mention of Rosemary anywhere in the piece. The second pause came 3 years later, when Trevor's mother was diagnosed with early-onset dementia and the family determined, after several tense conversations about cost, that hiring a professional caretaker wasn't financially feasible given the business's current cash flow that Rosemary, still managing the books, understood rather better than Trevor seemed to, since she was the one reconciling the accounts each month and watching exactly how much of the firm's revenue was being reinvested into growth rather than distributed as income. She'd taken on the caretaking role herself, driving to her mother-in-law's house 4 days a week for nearly 2 years, managing medications, doctor's appointments, and the slow, difficult decline of a woman who had never been particularly warm toward her but who Rosemary had cared for anyway, out of a sense of family obligation that Trevor, notably, never quite matched with equivalent sacrifice of his own time. By the time the marriage reached its 10th year, something had shifted in Trevor that Rosemary struggled, for a long time, to name precisely. The business had grown substantially by then, profitable enough that Trevor had hired a proper accounting firm to handle the books professionally, quietly displacing Rosemary from the role she'd occupied for 6 years without much ceremony or acknowledgement of the transition, simply informing her one evening that the new firm's going to take over the books going forward, should make things easier for you. Rosemary remembered the specific, hollow feeling of that conversation, the sense of being decommissioned from a job she'd never been hired for in the first place, and therefore couldn't quite grieve the loss of in any socially legible way. Trevor began traveling more that year, trips he described as client visits and industry conferences, trips that grew steadily more frequent as the 11th year of the marriage wore on. Rosemary noticed the changes gradually, a new attentiveness to his appearance before these trips, a phone that stayed locked and face down on counters in a way it hadn't before, a growing impatience with her whenever she asked simple questions about his schedule. She told herself, for longer than she was later comfortable admitting, that she was imagining things, that 11 years of marriage had simply worn some of the ease out of their communication, that this was what happened to couples as they aged past the initial romance into something more practical and less effusive. The credit card statement that finally broke through her careful self-deception arrived almost by accident, a paper statement mailed to the house instead of the usual digital notification due to some processing error at the bank, landing in Rosemary's hands on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon 8 months before the divorce filing. She'd opened it out of habit, expecting nothing unusual, and found instead a hotel charge in a city Trevor had told her was purely a solo work trip, a charge for a room booked under his name with a rate structure, 2 adults, one of the itemized fees noted, that made the work conference explanation considerably harder to sustain. She didn't confront him immediately. Some part of her, the same part that had spent 11 years absorbing disappointments quietly and finding practical ways to manage rather than escalate, spent the following several weeks gathering more information before she said anything at all, reviewing old statements she still had access to from her years managing the books, cross-referencing travel dates against calendar entries, building, without fully realizing at the time that this was what she was doing, the foundation of a case, rather than simply an emotional reckoning. When she finally confronted him, on a quiet Sunday evening in their kitchen, Trevor hadn't denied it so much as seemed almost relieved to stop pretending, a reaction that told Rosemary, more than any specific admission, exactly how little the marriage had actually meant to him by that point. He moved out within the month. The divorce filing came shortly after, and it was somewhere in those early weeks of separation, sitting alone in the house they'd shared for a decade, going through old files out of some mixture of grief and practical necessity, that Rosemary began to understand, with a clarity that surprised her, the actual scale of what she'd contributed to Trevor's business and life over 11 years, and began, quietly and methodically, to document it. The forensic accountant's name was Diane Okonkwo, recommended to Rosemary by a divorce attorney friend who'd warned her, gently but firmly, during their first coffee meeting 3 months after Trevor moved out, that emotional arguments rarely moved the needle in cases like this. Judges see heartbreak every single day, her friend had said. What they don't see very often is a spouse who actually did the math. Rosemary had taken the advice seriously, in the same careful, methodical way she'd approached most difficult problems throughout her marriage, and had hired Diane the following week, handing over 6 years of bank statements, tax filings, and the business records she'd managed to retain copies of from her years running Kellerman Strategic Partners books before Trevor's professional accounting firm had quietly taken over. Diane's investigation took nearly 4 months, longer than Rosemary had initially anticipated, partly because the firm's records from the earlier years proved harder to fully reconstruct than either of them expected, and partly because what Diane found as she dug deeper kept expanding the scope of what needed documenting. The picture that emerged was more damning than Rosemary had even privately suspected during her own preliminary review. Diane's report calculated that Rosemary's unpaid bookkeeping work over 6 years, cross-referenced against the market rate for a comparable financial administrator with the firm's transaction volume and complexity, represented an opportunity cost of approximately $310,000 in foregone wages, money that had effectively subsidized the firm's growth during its most critical expansion years. Separately, Rosemary's 2 years of caretaking for Trevor's mother, calculated against the market rate for professional in-home dementia care in their region, represented another $86,000 in labor the family had avoided paying for specifically because Rosemary had absorbed it herself. More significant than either figure alone was what Diane's forensic work revealed about the firm's actual financial trajectory during the years Rosemary had managed its books, a period during which Trevor had begun, gradually and initially in small amounts, moving portions of the firm's revenue into a separate investment account that had never been disclosed as marital property during any of their financial discussions, an account that had grown, by the time of the divorce filing, to just over $400,000, built almost entirely from business revenue generated during years when Rosemary's unpaid labor had kept the firm's operating costs low enough to generate that surplus in the first place. Rosemary hadn't known about the account's existence until Diane found it, buried in a chain of transfers between business and personal accounts that had been structured, whether deliberately or simply through careless accumulation, in a way that made it easy to overlook unless someone was specifically looking for it. She remembered the particular, cold clarity of the afternoon Diane called to walk her through the discovery, sitting at her kitchen table with a legal pad, taking notes in a handwriting that grew increasingly steady even as the numbers being described grew increasingly enormous, some part of her recognizing that she was watching the last of her naivety about the marriage finally, completely dissolve. She'd spent the months following that discovery working with her attorney, a measured, unflashy woman named Preeti Suresh who specialized in complex marital asset cases, to build a full accounting of the marriage's actual financial history, weaving Diane's forensic findings together with Rosemary's own contemporaneous records, old emails discussing business decisions, calendar entries documenting the caretaking schedule for Trevor's mother, bank statements showing the pattern of unpaid labor, stretching back across the better part of a decade. What emerged wasn't an argument about hurt feelings or betrayal, though both of those things were certainly present in Rosemary's private experience of the divorce. It was, instead, a precise, documented account of exactly how much unpaid financial and administrative labor she had contributed to a business that Trevor had, throughout the entire process, been quietly describing to his attorney and to mutual friends as something he'd built essentially alone, with a wife who'd contributed little beyond moral support. The letter itself, the one Rosemary submitted to Judge Alvarez separately from Preeti's formal filing, had taken her nearly 3 weeks to write, going through several drafts before she found the tone she wanted. Not pleading, not emotional in the way Trevor clearly expected, but simply, exhaustively factual, laying out the 11 years of the marriage in a chronological account that let the accumulated weight of specific dates and specific dollar figures speak for itself rather than relying on any appeal to sympathy. She'd included Diane's forensic report as an attachment, along with copies of the bank statements and business records that supported each claim, building the letter less as a personal statement and more as a companion document to the evidence itself, designed to give the judge a clear narrative frame for understanding numbers that might otherwise have felt abstract on the page. She hadn't told Trevor or Coleman that the letter existed in this form. Her formal legal filings, prepared by Preeti, had referenced a forensic accounting report and requested an equitable division of marital assets, including the previously undisclosed investment account, but the specific, granular detail, the exact hourly calculations, the itemized years of unpaid caretaking, the precise chronology of when and how Trevor had begun diverting business revenue into an account he'd never mentioned, existed primarily within the letter itself, a document Trevor had apparently assumed, based on his own dismissive expectations of what an emotional soon-to-be ex-wife might submit to a family court judge, would consist of little more than a wounded, rambling account of his personal failings as a husband. The morning of the hearing, Rosemary had arrived early, dressed carefully in a plain navy suit, and had taken her seat at the plaintiff's table with a calm she'd worked hard to cultivate over the preceding months, understanding that whatever happened in that courtroom, she had already done the actual work of building her case long before anyone raised their voice or made any argument aloud. She watched Trevor arrive 15 minutes later with Coleman, both men projecting the easy, unbothered confidence of people who believed they already understood exactly how the day would unfold. Trevor's comment about her crying before they reached the settlement discussion had stung, in the moment, in some small, old, familiar way that Rosemary recognized as the residue of 11 years of being underestimated by this particular man. But the sting passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, something closer to anticipation than hurt, as she watched Judge Alvarez open the folder containing her letter and begin, slowly and carefully, to read. The courtroom's quiet stretched longer than anyone besides Rosemary and Preeti had apparently expected. Judge Alvarez read for nearly 4 minutes without looking up, her expression giving away nothing, occasionally turning to reference what Rosemary knew to be the attached forensic report, cross-checking figures, pausing at certain pages longer than others. Rosemary watched, from the corner of her eye, as Trevor's initial smirk began to falter somewhere around the 90-second mark, his posture shifting slightly in his chair, some flicker of uncertainty crossing his face as the silence stretched well past whatever brief, dismissible reading he'd apparently anticipated. When Judge Alvarez finally looked up, she removed her glasses and set them down on the folder with a deliberate, unhurried precision that seemed, to Rosemary, to carry its own quiet verdict before a single word had been spoken. "Mr. Kellerman," the judge said, her tone even and measured but carrying an edge that made Coleman sit up slightly straighter beside his client, "I've reviewed a forensic accounting report attached to your wife's statement, documenting approximately $396,000 in unpaid labor she provided to your business and your family over the course of this marriage, alongside evidence of an investment account containing over $400,000 in business-derived funds that does not appear in any of the financial disclosures your attorney submitted to this court." She paused, letting the specific numbers settle into the room. "I'd like to understand why that account wasn't disclosed, and I'd like your attorney to explain, specifically, what his understanding was of your wife's financial contributions to the marriage, given that your own filings describe her as having contributed little of financial substance." Coleman's confident posture had entirely evaporated by this point, his hand moving toward the folder in front of him with the specific, scrambling energy of a lawyer realizing, in real time, that the case he'd prepared no longer matched the case actually in front of the judge. Trevor, for his part, had gone very pale, his earlier smirk replaced by something closer to genuine alarm, glancing toward Coleman for guidance that didn't immediately arrive. "Your Honor," Coleman began, "I'd like to request a brief recess to review this report with my client." "You'll have time to review it," Judge Alvarez said. "But I want to be clear about something before we proceed. I have sat on this bench for 14 years, and I have seen a great many divorce proceedings where one spouse attempts to characterize the other's contributions as insignificant, usually because acknowledging those contributions accurately would require a considerably less favorable division of assets. What I don't see very often is a case this thoroughly documented. Mrs. Kellerman didn't submit a letter asking this court for sympathy. She submitted an accounting." She looked directly at Trevor now, her expression unreadable but unmistakably sharpened. "I'd suggest your side use the recess productively, Mr. Coleman, because based on what I've read so far, your client's characterization of this marriage bears very little resemblance to the documented facts in front of me." The recess that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Coleman and Trevor conferred urgently in a side room, and during which Rosemary sat quietly with Preeti in the hallway, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a sense of settled, grounded calm rather than anxiety about what came next. When the hearing resumed, Coleman's tone had shifted entirely, moving from confident dismissal to careful negotiation, and by the end of the session, the framework for a settlement had begun taking shape that looked nothing like the outcome Trevor had spent months confidently predicting to friends and family, an equitable division that accounted fully for the undisclosed investment account, along with a negotiated settlement reflecting the documented value of Rosemary's unpaid labor across 11 years of marriage. Rosemary didn't feel triumphant walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, not exactly. What she felt was something quieter and more durable than triumph, the specific, hard-won satisfaction of having been taken seriously, finally, by someone whose opinion carried actual weight, after 11 years of being systematically underestimated by the one person who should have valued her most.